Today is September the 5th, 1995, and we're interviewing Sidney H. Taylor in the Historical Society's video room on Stone Street. Where do you live, Mr. Taylor?
818 Oak Tree Terrace, DeLand.
And how old are you?
81.
Where were you born?
I was born in Erie, Pennsylvania.
And what about your parents' names?
My father was Harry L. Taylor. My mother was Janet Howard Taylor.
And how long have you lived in DeLand?
I've lived in DeLand since this month in 1919. I first came to DeLand about this month, I first came in 1918, and I've lived here since 1919 in September.
You've been here a long time. Why did your parents decide to come to DeLand?
That's a long story, but my brother was critically ill, my younger brother, and the doctors in Erie said they would have to come to a warmer climate. My father was the Episcopal minister at Trinity Church in Erie, Pennsylvania. So we came down that fall and winter, and while he was here, he made arrangements with the Bishop of South Florida to obtain an Episcopal church in this area. And one of the places we visited was DeLand. So, and then he returned to Erie in the spring, and after resigning there, he came, and he was offered a pick of places. He chose DeLand because it was a college town. He was quite a scholar in his way.
And what church was that?
St. Barnabas Episcopal Church.
Right. And how long was he there at the church?
24 years.
24 years. That is wonderful. And where did you go to school?
Well, DeLand schools. Went to Porter Military Academy until the banks failed for a short period, and then went to Stetson University, law school and college.
Do you remember any of your classmates at elementary school or high school?
Sure. See what's left of them all the time. I know them all.
You want to name
well.
a couple names that are...
Well, we thought our Depression class, we graduated in 1931. At the bottom of the Depression, we thought we were always the best. And among my closest friends and my classmates was Fielding Chapman, for instance, who, among other things, became Commandant of the United States Marine Corps, Director of Immigration and Naturalization of the United States, several other things. Boise Zell became a circuit judge in in Miami. Various all of them did well.
Well, that is certainly.
And we had nothing when we left, that was for sure.
Well, sometimes I think hard times, like in school, it really makes you work a little harder. What about some of your teachers? Do you remember any of their names that you might want to mention?
Well, there were dozens of them, and I think I could remember them all, both of the Bouchel sisters and the Eccles sisters. Only had one Eccles, so Lottie, and the Bradleys, but in later years, well, for instance, in high school, Mrs. Woodbury, Mary Fox Clardy was our Latin teacher, Cap Parrott taught French. I can name names if you want, but they're all in the books.
Some of those names I remember too, and yes, I do. What about in college? Did you keep up with some of your friends after you graduated? And
yes, we were all close together all the time.
Do you remember what size your graduating class was at
DeLand High?
At DeLand High.
81, I think it was.
Oh, such a difference from now, isn't it? Did you play any sports?
No, I kept playing at them and get injured, and I never really played. My first injury was in basketball. In those days, the court was right up against the benches, and I got thrown one time. I hit my knee against the corner of the bench, and that knocked me out for that
Ooh.
season, and
That's not
so
good.
on.
Mm-hmm. Were you in service?
Yes, I was in the Marine Corps.
Marine Corps? Did you have overseas duty, or did you have?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Where all were you? Where were some
In
of
the Solomons, Bougainville, Green Island, and then the Philippines.
Uh-huh. How long were you in service?
Well, I was on active duty from early in 1943 until, well, it was just on the eve of Christmas 1945 that I came home.
Mm-hmm.
I was still on terminal leave.
Mm-hmm. Well, we all know that you were certainly a very prominent lawyer in DeLand. How many years?
Well, I retired last year, and I practiced 57 years. I was admitted in 1937.
That's a long
Retired in
time.
1984.
Uh-huh. Did you practice alone, or were you in with other men, or how was that?
Well, at first, for years, Joe Hendricks was my partner, but he was in Congress, so I did most of the work.
Uh-huh.
And my son, I'm associated, or was until I retired, with my son's firm now, Taylor and Early.
Mm-hmm. And how did you decide to be a lawyer?
Well, it was partly need. Entering college in 1931, you couldn't go to Harvard or Princeton and all. I went to Stetson because I could live at home and eat at home and everything else. My father taught there, among other things, to help Stetson because they were having hard times too, and he was a PhD and a Phi Beta Kappa and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So he volunteered to teach some courses so they could hold their accreditation. And I think that first year, either he taught for my scholarship or I got a scholarship because he taught. From then on, I had work scholarships most of the time, and was a lot better off than a lot of my classmates who, well, my partner, Joe Hendricks, later, I used to envy them. They lived in the basement of the Alabama apartments. He and his younger half-brother, and he'd been an orphan for a long time. He was putting all of his siblings through college and trying to go himself.
Oh.
So he would go to school for a year and then work hard for a year trying to support them and keep them going. And I used to bemoan the fact that I had a nice, comfortable bed all to myself at home, and my brother had another room and had parents feeding me, watching out for me. But Joe and his half-brother Dennis lived in the basement of the Alabama apartments, tending the furnace and keeping up the scant lawn and all there was, sort of janitors. Each of them had a little cot, and it was a cozy little private nook. But the thing that I really admired was their ingenuity. In the wintertime, when the football games were on particularly, they'd buy peanuts and we'd roast them in the furnace that they tended, and then package them, and Dennis would go out in the street and sell them. And at the games particularly, we'd build up a big pile of little brown paper sacks of roasted peanuts and sell it to game. They had a built-in factory, everything.
Well, you certainly admire it. You certainly admire it.
We're close to starving, but not actually.
When did you marry?
1940.
And who did you marry?
Mary Ovita Cheatham.
Were you married here in DeLand, or do you want to tell something, just some little something about?
No, we dated together from high school days, and her family was struggling, my family was struggling. We held off until I finally could make a living.
And you were married at the St. Barnabas Church?
St. Barnabas.
What about your children? How many children?
I have 2 living children.
And what are their names?
Richard Walter, and that's my son who's practicing law here, and Harry Floyd, who is a behavior modification specialist of some sort in Atlanta.
Well, I know your son here, and he's a very nice man. What about grandchildren?
2 wonderful grandchildren.
What are their names?
One's Christina Marcille Taylor, and the other's Sidney H. Taylor II.
Oh, nice.
They're both at Florida State, however.
I also know that the DeLand Airport was named for you. Could you tell us how and why, something about it?
Well, I'd almost rather not. It was really an outgrowth of the fight for the relocation of the courthouse. which I wound up being, well, I guess I was the acknowledged leader. I was appointed by the attorneys to head the attorneys' fight against moving the courthouse, and then the Chamber of Commerce and everybody else fell in behind and let us decide the course to take. So out of gratitude afterwards, they were going to name something for me, and they started off with New York Avenue, and I raised Cain. I said, that's not fair to all those people living there. And I proposed the sewer plant, which is very useful and a worthy civic project, a necessary one. But they decided on the airport, and I guess that's fair because Wiley Nash is entitled to the sewer treatment plant, which is a credit to the community.
Well, I tell you, we all know that you're a very well-liked person, and that was a nice honor, and we're happy to do that.
It was an honor.
Would you tell us about growing up in DeLand, sort of from a child's eye view?
Well, I guess that's where I should begin about DeLand. As I say, although I had been here, it was just one of the towns I visited with my parents in 1918, but when we came in 1919, one of my clearest visions is of our first day. The Episcopal Rectory in those days was at the southwest corner of Clara in Minnesota. Mm-hmm. And among other things, it's now historically famous. There was a great big juniper tree in front, a huge one, much bigger than it is now by all means. And it was an old rectory. The previous priest in charge of the parish had left the previous Easter because DeLand was still small and there wasn't too much going on, but there was good prospects and all. He was a bachelor, and I know when my mother from a spick and span rectory in Erie walked in the doors with some of the ladies of the church, she was a little appalled because it had stood idle and no air conditioning all in those days, and it was musty and mildewy and everything else. But there were one of the things that completely horrified her were cockroaches. You'd have thought they were dragons. And she turned to old Mrs. Bradley, who lived across the street, who was an Episcopalian and was there with 3 of her daughters to help get us settled and so on. She turned to her and said, what can you do about these miserable things, or something to that effect. And I remember Mrs. Bradley's words. She says, there's only one thing you can do about the money. And my mother brightened right up. Here she was, a Yankee matron coming down, and here a grandmotherly Southerner was going to impart some housewifely secrets to her and everything. Mother brightened up. Mrs. Bradley says, learn to love them. I thought that's a typical thing about it. But other things I remember about that day as we were in there, there was a whole set of bone-handled steak knives or stainless steel knives, all of them rusty. And Carrie Bradley showed me how to clean knives. She took some water and she went out in the backyard and she poured it down in the sand and she jabbed the knives up and down in the sand till they were clean. So I learned how to sand your knives. And they told me about things that I wasn't aware of. The hedge around the house was Cattleya guavas, and I wasn't familiar with guavas. The great big trees, which, as I recall, well, sooner or later they were in full bearing, but boy, we loved those mulberries. We'd sit up in the tree all day and pick the worms off, but eat the mulberries.
I love the guava jelly too.
And the yard was planted with citrus trees. My regret was that my father didn't have a horse, because the barn was for a horse, it wasn't for a car. We had a car, but and it was a good spacious thing. There are 3 houses now on that same lot, and wonderful neighbors and kids up and down the street, and it was just a delightful place to grow up in, and it was by present standards primitive. One of our great pleasures was after a rain, and particularly when we came, it was just like now, it was a good rainy season, and the mud puddles developed. See, there weren't any paved streets, and there would be mud puddles all over, and pretty soon there'd be tadpoles in them. See, and all the boys, we'd gather jars of tadpoles and watch their tails fall off and put them on the windowsill at home, and so on and so forth. And Boise Zell from South Carolina, he lived 3 houses down the street. We always were charmed by his lingo, because he called them toad frogs when they grew up. And we called them frogs, but he called them toad frogs. Things of that nature. In fact, there was such a variety of people up and down the streets and all. I first couldn't understand why Mrs. Vanderhoof's front porch was the stoop and somebody else's was the veranda, and so on. But they were from the different parts of the country. And my father explained to me how the Dutch would call it a stoop and so on. I was learning about that. And the heroes around, one of my favorites was Captain McConnell, who lived at the southeast corner of Rich and Adele. He had commanded the lead battleship at the Battle of Manila Bay, and he had been on duty in Asia, on the Asiatic station for years, and he had a house full of Chinese, Japanese things, you know, an elephant tusk and ivory things. He was just a charming elderly gentleman, and his funeral was the first one I ever officiated in on that one I wasn't a crucifer, I carried the flag, and the flag was too tall for me, so I had to pick up the tail end of it and carry it with the pole so it wouldn't drag on the ground. There were, of course, as I say, it was lovely, and this probably isn't of any historical importance, but think of the things that kids don't have now. First of all, we didn't have television, and people knew each other, and they sat on their porches in the cool of the evening and rocked, and you walked back and forth, and everybody chatted with everybody as they went up and down the street. And the exotic plants were something. I'd never seen a pomegranate. Miss Vanderhoof had 4 or 5 trees in her yard. There was others around. People had pineapples growing up. And not only were they the Cattleya guavas, strawberry guavas, there was all kinds of nice things. But the interesting things used to be now, in those days, Clara and Minnesota were paved with shell, which came from Hontoon or from the Ziegler shell pit, you know. And the trucks would come and dump the shell, and we'd scurry around and find arrowheads and pottery and bones. My brother still has a whole collection he gathered back in those days. It was fascinating, and of course, if you fell off your bike on the new shell, you got cut up. I've still got scars in my chin from being stuck in the shell. But the other streets were pine straw, and they were delightful to play in. Just almost a perfect playing ground, you know. The straw was soft and a little bit slipped and everything, but but we had a little problem with those because Howard Stewart was mayor then, and he lived on the corner of Clara and Michigan, and we used to play football. Well, we played hide and seek too at first on San Souci, just back of his house. And one time, Ada Poe, whose husband at that time was postmaster, if I remember right. But anyway, she used to sit upright in her car, and she was driving down San Souci Avenue, and there was a big bunch of loose pine straw in front of her. Just as she got to it, Donald Stewart rose up out of it. He was, David Stewart, he was the baby. And she screamed and almost had a tizzy, you know. So she reported it, and the city fathers pondered it, and they decided that we would have to have someplace like that to play. So when we were going to play, particularly football, we had to let the police department know, and Louis Ryanfield would come out on his motorcycle and tie a rope from one side, the trees, of course, on both sides of the street. In those days, he'd tie a rope across there on Michigan, and he'd tie another rope across on Minnesota, and we had our playing field. That was all right. Soon solved the problem. No extra assessment or levy or anything else.
Such a difference in from now, isn't it? Just such, it's unbelievable, the difference.
And we had all these characters. I mentioned Captain McConnell, but we had Ike Stewart, who was always blowing off his top about something, and it was charming, and he, even in later years, built a loudspeaker in at his office where he broadcast these violent ring against the ring speeches, etc., etc. We had Miss Lizzie Scarlett lived out there where, well, part of her property is now the hospital. The family gave that for the hospital, West Volusia Hospital. Her house was up there on the hill. And Kitty Finney and 2 or 3 others, true dowagers, and they had their place downtown. Wasn't parking problems in those days so much, but everybody knew where to find them. They would come have their chauffeur drive them downtown and hold court. And Miss, for instance, Lizzie Scarlett would pull up just beside the back door of Allen Drugstore, and nobody would take that place. She parked there for hours. She had flowers in vases on the side of her car, landau, you know, and so on. And old Mr. Fountain would come across the street and pay his respects. And Pete Allen would come out and pay his respects. And Woodall, the grocer, H. Woodall, would come down and speak to her, and the barber would come out and speak to her, and all of her friends would drop by because they knew that's where she'd be. But in the next block, her competition was in front of Barr's Hardware, no, Ford's Dry Goods, and she would hold court there, and Mr. Ford would bring out fabrics and all, because she loved clothes, and she would select fabrics, and Miss Butner would come down and discuss patterns with her, so on. It was just so friendly and easy-going and pleasant, and now I can walk up and down the street and not see anybody I know, but in those days, you knew every person, at least every white person, most of the colored people, and most of the dogs you knew by name.
It's just so different. What about the old, excuse me, go ahead.
Go ahead.
What about the old hospital, the dedication, and afterward it being moved to the air base? Could you tell something about that?
Yes, as I told you, that would be one thing I could remember because I did have a connection with it. My earliest memory was the dedication of the hospital, which was, what, 1921 or something. And my father was on the board, but he gave the invocation at the dedication, or it may have been the benediction, something. He was one of the preachers. And Dr. Ferris, who was Vice President Stetson, gave the main address. But the thing that I remember so distinctly about it is, I know that this was right after the war, and the soldier boys were home, and we knew soldier boys, and we knew Army uniforms and everything, but we knew them as peaceful friends and neighbors. Well, they were lined up out front there. There must have been at least a dozen of them, and because my father was on the top of the steps there with the other speakers and so forth, David Stewart and I were standing by his father, who was a returned veteran and so on, and apparently in command of the firing squad. And then something was said, and the men moved and something else, and then they shot. And I jumped a mile. I ran to my mother because I never thought that in DeLand anybody would be shooting anybody, you know.
Right.
And they fired the salutes and so forth. And then there was a lot of times at the hospital, and my father was on the board for many years. In fact, they immediately ran into trouble. And I remember the hospital was built by the citizens. There was no tax money, nothing. It was volunteer. It was a memorial to the World War. One dead, and there was, what, 4 of them. I hope the plaque's still out there. But so that wasn't many from Volusia County. But the land, the building, everything else, except there was a debt, was donated by the citizens. I mentioned that because for years we operated without any tax help, and then the taxpayers were called on to buy it again and again and again. Each time the taxpayers paid for it more and more and more. It went in the tax funds in a way because the court awarded all those hospital properties to the Fish Trust. When they built the Fish Hospital, that was built with taxpayers' money. Fish left money, but the main thing he wanted to leave was power. But it was built with Hill Burton funds. They got a tax exemption on all Fish properties, groves, office buildings, everything else, all these other things. So really the taxpayers built it. But the Fish Trust not only got the airport property and this property, but they had all the trust funds people had given and everything else. It's called the Cypre doctrine, and it was fair. When something was given to charity, if the charity ceased to operate, it was given to the next most similar charity. And it developed when there were trusts for people returning from the Crusades after they'd all died off. Particularly it was true of trusts that were created for seamen before the mast. Well, when you didn't have seamen before the mast anymore, you had power-driven ships. They just made it to all sailors and so forth. But then, of course, the Fish Trust sold it to the school board, and the school board sold it to the city of DeLand. Each time, the price went up, and the taxpayers had to dig out more money for what they had originally given. But right after, they weren't able to meet the mortgage, and then the Episcopal Church, Diocese of South Florida, took over with the DeLand Hospital and ran it for several years, and then that's when my father was really involved. And then after the war, things had become critical. You can't imagine what condition it was in, because you couldn't maintain the elevator, particularly hadn't been able to maintain it during the war, and the funds were short too. And then a lot of the patients were out at the Navy base, because all the wives, the children that were born to men in the service, they could go to the military hospital out at the base. So we'd have a staff of I can't think of the word, nursery, no, it's not nursery, obstetric nurses on duty. They couldn't do anything else in the hospital under regulations. They had to stay there. They couldn't go to any contagious person's room or anything like that, and no patients. But anyway, it was in sort of dreadful condition, and for some reason I got elected on the board and as president at that time, and I forget the year, 1946. And from then on, I really sweated in this hospital. But, and it was nip and tuck. The whole board suffered and almost had fits when we realized that we would have to increase the per diem charge for a hospital room from $6 to $8 a day. So we thought, how can these people afford it, and yet we can't operate without it. We had, of course, lots of people who didn't pay. Most often did pay. But I remember one person in particular, some rural resident out there by the depot, an elderly woman, got bit by a rattlesnake, and she was brought in, and she was so thankful that her life had been saved, and she recognized that it had, and so did, I think, Dr. West was the one that attended her. We thought that we'd achieved a victory in saving her life. And she said she couldn't pay, she would do her best. Well, for years, she would bring me a quarter every week. But the main thing was, she said her boy was going to school, and it was on Wisconsin Avenue at that time, and she sent 2 eggs every day that she had 2 eggs, which the hospital kitchen could use. See, but that was until she felt, and we felt that her bill was paid. But it was 25 cents every time, and she was working and so on, but not making really any money, just struggling for support. And in fact, one of the things I had the obstetrician nursing do out at when we moved out to the air base was darn sheets and everything. They couldn't go to other rooms, but they could mend the sheets. And one time, a little boy up at Seville, except I think it's closer than that. Anyway, he got dreadfully burnt in a gasoline fire, and you didn't send them off to the Shriners Hospital or anything. Then you took care of them as you could, and that was about to kill us. Well, it was just amazing how much expense that was. But first of all, we started a campaign in the paper about the dire need and all the little school children raised $10, $15 or so on and contributed to them and wrote him notes and this. But that's one thing I had them do. We asked for any spare sheets, linens, anything else. And one of the things the nurses did who had the obstructive ward was tear up sheets, because he took bandages and bandages and bandages, things like that. But it was so bad that when the opportunity presented to get the Navy base hospital, well, of course, we seized it. It cost nothing. It could be ours. Now, there was some expense, but they couldn't see how the budget could even stand moving all the equipment, patients, everything else. And I kind of led the ball. I said, no, the people will do it. And they all agreed if we could get them to do it. Well, they did. We just made demands and commandeered cars and everything else in line. The main thing was getting it organized. But had fight with the ambulances. I said, no. It says, each one of you are going to transport these patients that need ambulance transportation, and we're not going to pay a penny. and they finally agreed. But other people, then the doctors were fearful because we weren't handling it with the safety that they felt they might be responsible for. We had one baby in an incubator, and the practical nurses, particularly Mrs. Wooten, she told me, Elvira Wooten, she says, that baby's been out of the incubator for hours at a time, says, it's all right, you can take him out there. I won't say the doctor's name. He said, no, I cannot permit it, I'll be liable, and so on and so forth. And so I talked to the parents, and they said, well, we certainly care, but we believe that she can be moved all right. So I had Pop Ella, I remember driving the car with the incubator, and Jack Nutting standing by to connect it when he got out there. And Mrs. Wooten wrapped it up in a blanket and got in one car, and we zoomed out there, and everything went fine. But the whole thing, the detergents, dish towels, the pots and pans, an operating table, x-ray equipment, everything else was moved in pretty fast order without any expense because everybody rallied to. The cars were lined up way down there and given express instructions, and it was all timed. This one was to go to the kitchen with what we were putting in theirs, and people in the kitchen knew it was coming, they knew where to put it. It was a pleasure, and it shows how well the town can work together when it needs to. The same way with the courthouse relocation. That was a magnificent united effort of the town. Everybody worked and did what they could, and to the point, for instance, we didn't have any money. There was plenty of contributions, but Daytona Chamber of Commerce alone put up $100,000 to get a feasibility study. We had nowhere near that much money, but we had expenses for different things. We had to pay by law a penny for a copy of each of the petition cards, but it was a penny for a photostatic copy. So we devised how, and these petitions were all on postcard size files, telling people that filed to change the location of the county seat. Well, we figured out we could put them, and I think we got 64 on a sheet that they then photostat for whatever it was, a penny, and so on. And there were 70-something thousand, obviously. But we had nice little old ladies who, with scissors, cut those apart. We wanted to file them in alphabetical order and everything else. And one woman, her hand was bleeding and blistered and then started bleeding, and she kept right on cutting. I know, but there were so many instances like that we did a tremendous job at no expense because everybody got together and worked on it. And talking about the hospital now, one of the great women in DeLand, in my opinion, was Amy Mann, who was nurse at the hospital from before I came until long after we moved out to the air base. And I remember the story. I wasn't personally there, but when the banks failed and in the Depression, everybody was in a panic, and of course the hospital board was particularly. And my father said that Miss Mann said that she had talked to the nurses, and if they could keep enough food in there for them to eat, they wouldn't wait, or they wouldn't ask for their pay until the money was available. They would keep on working if they could have just barely enough to live on. Now, most of them lived in the nurse's house over there, and the X-ray technician lived in the house next to it. Both were on hospital property. But in talking about women, there were plenty of famous and great ones that people somewhat have forgotten on. Those, for instance, Jimmy Fisher had one. He couldn't find a Mrs. Warstell, W-A-R-S-T-E-L-L, it was Worstel, and she organized the garden club, and they were fascinating people. He had been a petroleum engineer in China for years, and they had all kinds of exotic plants, so forth. Mrs. Leary, Mrs. McGregor, who had, as she said and admitted, more influence in Washington than any woman except Mary Bethune, which was not exactly what Mrs. McGregor liked, because she was pure Alabama. But there are so many things. Do you think of anything?
Well, I tell you, I knew there was a lot of wonderful people in DeLand, but by hearing this, I even am more know it even more so.
Well, as it comes to mind, I mentioned Mrs. Leary. It may be of interest to my vision of the bank failure in 29. But we were all playing up near the high school. Somebody told us Volusia County Bank had busted. I think that was the word. But anyway, it had failed. And so we got on our bikes and we went downtown, and here was a big mob in front of the Volusia County Bank. And at that time, Mrs. Houston, who lived, well, where University is now, she was talking, trying to calm people down. Mrs. Leary had just finished, I understand. Dr. Holy had spoken, but everybody was, needless to say, upset.
Very much.
But I was standing with a couple of friends on the edge of the crowd there, just by the side of Fisher's drugstore. Oh, we were blocking the street. There were so many people around. And this old gentleman from, not old, he was just middle-aged, young farmer-type man came in, and I forget where from now, but it was the north end of the county. He had overalls on, and he'd come to town, and he came up to us on the edge of the crowd and says, "What's going on?" And we told him, "The bank failed." "Oh, what's that mean?" He said, "Well, can't get any money out." He says, "I can't get my money out?" He said, "That's what we understand." And I was watching his face. He dove his hand in his overall pocket, and he pulled out a quarter and a dime, and he looked at it, and he says, "My God Almighty, 35 cents and 7 head to feed," and his eyes were glazed over. It was just pitiful. But that was the way it was when the bank failed. It was really tough. And we'd been through the boom, and everything had been happy, bustling and everything else, and then, of course, the Medfly came and the hurricanes came and so on. But the bank failure beat the collapse of Wall Street as far as the local citizens were concerned.
What about something funny that happened in court? Do you
Oh
remember
boy, there's so many things. Of course, that's another fascination. Raymond Burr wasn't on television, and so the people, I mean, from Oak Hill and O'Armond and Seville and Osteen, they all came to town. This was the county seat. They came to town on court days, and they brought their families, and they brought their food and everything else, and we'd go listen to these trials, and they were fascinating sometimes, and horrifying sometimes, so on and so forth. And then every now and then we'd have a hanging, and that was right downtown too. And so there was interest, see, but and talk about the O.J. Simpson case. It was being tried on the television, and it's being tried individually too. But those cases, after morning in court, they all retired to the bank. I mean, to the vacant lot, the park across the street, and take out their lunches and everything. And everybody would talk, and everybody would rehash the case. You know, each his opinion. They weren't on the jury, anything else, but they and the performance of the lawyers and the character of the defendant and everything. It used to be interesting. Of course, everything was there, the aroma and everything else. See, there was a peanut stand there, and you could smell the peanuts for a block away. It was just, there was a broad expanse of shell under the trees that was just firm enough and leveled off enough and had just enough dust to make an ideal marble shooting place. See, we kids were shooting marbles, and the women were gathered together over here, and the men were gathered over here, and the kids were running around playing, and there were swings and so forth, and it was just a constant fiesta, particularly on court days. But I don't know, there's so many times that, one thing, that this isn't going to hurt anybody, but one thing nice about DeLand, which reminded me years later of Rupert Brooks' Grantchester, where the clock was stuck and always had been, and if it said 1:45, you knew you were in Grantchester on the church steeple. Well, same way with DeLand. It was after the new courthouse was built, there were 4 clocks, as we know now, and at the corner of the First National Bank there were 4 sides to that clock. There were other clocks around, and one nice thing about you could tell about DeLand is never did one of them agree. They all were different times. So one time in court, I had a hearing before Judge with Judge McGregor, and Judge Frederick was the judge, and we waited on Judge McGregor and waited, and I got impatient, and the judge got impatient, and he said, well, if he doesn't show up, I'm going to award judgment for you. And about that time he came in, and Judge Frederick was a little bit annoyed with him and spoke to him about it. He said, Mr. Gravebeard, he says, you're late. And McGregor looked right at him and said, Your Honor, by what clock? So many well-known times. But talking about McGregor Day, and they're both dead, I hate to use names, but in Judge Peacock's court one time, but McGregor kept asking a witness a question that the judge had told him he could not ask. And he kept repeating it, and the Judge Peacock said, Mr. McGregor, if you ask that question one more time, I'll hold you in contempt of court. McGregor asked the question, see. So Peacock got a little mad. He was an old Marine too, and he ordered him up before the bench, and he said, I warned you. I gave you plenty of opportunity. He said, I now hold you in contempt of court. And McGregor said, how much? And he says, $10. McGregor made a great show in front of the jury and everybody else. He dug into his pockets and everything. He brought out nickels and dimes and quarters and bills, threw them on the thing, and shoved them over to the judge. The judge had his clerk count them, and she started giving money back to McGregor because there was more than $10 in this. Very quiet. And the judge, and McGregor said, what's that? And the judge says, well, that's your change. He says, no. He says, I got more contempt for this court than it thinks I have. And then they both laughed and took it in good play. But Phil Buck, I used to work in Fisher Drug Store in the late 20s, which was on the corner, and with no air conditioning. I could hear everything that went on in the courtroom because they had their windows open. We had our door and window open. It was hot and everything carried. You could hear Pat Sams roar. You could hear Phil Buck roar, and then you couldn't hear Erskine Landis hardly at all. But you could hear the whole case even while at work, you know, which was charming. And sometimes it was very primitive as lawyers go. They got away with more things. What one Duke Smyrna attorney, Zach Bass, he had one trick in particular. When the witness was testifying against his client, and he usually represented criminal cases, I mean defendants in criminal cases, Zach, if any evidence was favorable to him, he'd just sit there smiling like an angel and nodding his head. Absolute truth. He never said that, you know, but just his attitude. But when the critical point of a witness came, Zach, let me get another point too. Zach chewed tobacco. And in those days we had spittoons in the courtroom too. It was standard, big brass ones. See? And he used to practice up, or during the trial, he'd cut loose at the spittoon, and the jury would all turn to see if he had hit it, you know, and he'd do it every time. But this one particular case I remember, and it was a murder case, and it was coming to the, and Joe Scarlett was prosecuting it, and it was coming to the critical point where the defendant shot the man. And Zach, who had been leaning back in his chair, he was kind of rocking his chair, and he fell over backwards. And there was a big clutter and everything, and Zach got up and he apologized to the judge, he apologized to the jury, he apologized to the witness, he apologized to the state's attorney, he apologized to the court reporter, and a long, flowery apology, and sat down, and damn if Joe Scarlett didn't fail to ask the question again, and the jury had forgotten all about it by that time. They convicted the man anyway. Well, I can think of a lot more, but I don't think they're pertinent. It's just that there used to be a lot of interest and a lot of fun in court, and it was entertainment for people. When you look at what effort is being made in getting everybody familiar with the Simpson case, you can imagine without these forms of entertainment how people would flock to real, live cases right in their own community, and they would take sides.
Would you tell us about the university? Something about Stetson? Do you have a memory of that, or something you want to tell?
Well, I enjoyed every bit of it, and we were proud of it, particularly when we would beat Florida, which was very rarely, but one time we beat the University of Florida when University of Florida beat Harvard, who beat somebody else, so we figured we were number one. I forget how it was. And again, things were so different, and by our standards primitive, but so pleasant and wholesome and scholarly. We just enjoyed it. The libraries were full of good books. We didn't have computers. We didn't have much of anything, but it was delightful.
Mm-hmm. What about any organizations in DeLand? Do you have any comment on any of those?
We had every organization under the sun that belonged in those days. We still have them, but I mean, the women and the men both. That there was every lodge. I suppose they still have. I don't know where the Eagles or the Woodmen or anybody are now, but certainly the Masons and the Elks and the Odd Fellows, Knights of Pythias, and Lodge night was always a big night. Maybe the Knight Templars would attend in uniform and so on. It was quite a show. The Elks Club regularly had a minstrel, and they also had parades, initiation parades, with all the candidates for initiation dressed as convicts, and they would have a big parade down the boulevard. The Ku Klux Klan was doing very well, and they were very interesting. The last one I remember, when Roy Cook died. Roy Cook was Grand Dragon of the state of Florida, and the Klansmen came from everywhere. And I'm pretty sure it's his funeral. I remember the horses and all started down by where Woodland Manor is now, and paraded all the way through town. And then there were cars, and there were marching Klansmen and so on. So it was a huge demonstration, and I noticed out at the cemetery recently somebody's smashed red ink all over his tombstone out there, which is a great, I don't know if you've seen it or not, but it's got the, I think it says KKK on it, and the fiery cross and so on, but he was quite prominent. My main experience with the Klan, I saw a few other times, but oh gosh, I was 6 years old or something. Bobby Bond and Dooney Ford and Manton Roberts persuaded me that the Klan was meeting upstairs over the Coca-Cola plant, which the Rhodes ran, and they wanted to see, to find out what was going on up there. They knew there were regular meetings up there, and they got a dried giant bamboo pole and put me on it and stuck me up. They were too big to be pushed up. They pushed me up the side of the building till I could look in the window, and here were a bunch of men sitting in a square in straight chairs in their shirt sleeves, and it was always very dull. And I never found out whether it was the Klan or not, but I was told that it was the Oddfellows, but whatever it was, scared me to death. And I told them what was on. Well, they still convinced me that it was a Klan meeting, and it wasn't. I know when the Athens Theatre was opened, there was a big naturalization meeting, and just like we had on the 200th anniversary of the country, and we had it at Evans Center with a crowd, and there was, I think, over 200 people naturalized. We had all the circuit judges, the whole circuit there, and so on. We had this big performance at the Athens, partly because it was new, and all the civic organizations were invited to be represented. So the Klan put a big notice in the paper that they would be there, but under an oath of silence, and nobody was to talk to them or touch them, but they would be there in full regalia. They didn't want their voices to be heard as so that they would be identified, and there was a big commotion about that. And then later on, it was really the ring or the it was the anti-ring of the Klan that was going to have a meeting at Athens. In fact, Joyce Bowen, who's 95, who died last Friday, was telling me this one, and I had known about it, but I couldn't really remember. I'd known about it by hearsay, but just before the meeting, the mayor ordered a fire drill. And there is a state statute that prohibits anybody from crossing fire lines and so forth. And so as they came marching down the street to their big meeting in the Athens, Sheriff Morris stepped out and he says, "Gentlemen," he says, "there's fire lines here. And under section so-and-so of the Florida statutes, it's illegal to cross the fire lines." He said, "Now, I and my men are here. We can't arrest all of you. So instead," he says, "I know every one of you who's here. Whoever crosses that fire line, I'll arrest them tomorrow." Oh. so they stopped and debated, and they didn't cross the fire line. But things used to get a little raw too, and I think everybody knows. But one morning in particular in DeLand, it was quite a day. Men got up and kissed their wives goodbye and went to work, and a couple of friends matched coins for a drink in Volusia Pharmacy or something, and everybody was friendly and happy, and that night everybody was mad at everybody because that's the day they published in the paper how everybody voted in the city elections. And some wives didn't vote for the way their husband told them, and won, but I think I tried to check that, and they were mistaken. I've still got a copy of the paper. But supposedly one wife did not vote for her own husband, which would be understandable, politics being what they would. I think that's a smart wife who preferred her husband not get elected.
But not when she got home. Not when the husband got home, probably not very happy about
But supposedly
that.
secret ballot, and they'd been marked, and somebody had challenged whether they'd been marked, and so they published the list of how everybody voted, and nobody claimed it was wrong. And in fact, you could read the list and see that most everybody voted the way they were expected to vote, either ring or anti-ring. But there were 2 or 3 bankruptcies and some divorces, and everything else flowed from it. Watts Hardware was put out of business because he was supposed to vote right and he didn't, and it was boycotted.
Oh my. Well, what do you see as DeLand's greatest improvement? You've been here a long time.
Well, you see, I've been here so long and loved it so much that I think it's retrograded a little bit. No, its improvement is all the modern facilities. But no matter if they spend $1.5 million to restore it, the Athens Theatre is not and never will be what it was opening night. It was fairyland, and they call it a vaudeville movie and vaudeville house and everything, with some of the greatest artists in the country. For instance, I still have his program. Albert Spaulding, who was then supposed to be the premier violinist in the country. Damrosch is the chief violinist. He played before the Grand Dukes and the Emperors and so on in Europe. He's still in Encyclopedia Britannica, a column and a half. I've been there when he played. We had New York companies play. We had metropolitan singers give recitals, so on. But it wasn't all that. We also had Tom Mix. We had Buck Jones and all the rest of the cowboy things, so on. And we had boxing matches until we thought that was just too much for the Athens, and they opened a boxing arena over in the old Triangular Garage on Rich Avenue. But there used to even be boxing matches in the Athens. But I remember, and it wasn't opening night, but it was shortly after, and we were the guest of Mrs. Hyde, and it was the operetta Robin Hood, and it was delightful. By a New York company on its way to Miami, and they would stop here and in Orlando sometimes, but they were playing heavily in Miami at the height of the boom, but they also played in DeLand and usually in Jacksonville, and not in Daytona or Orange City either, but we were the Athens of Florida. But during the play, or during the operetta, and Robin was singing beautifully on the stage, but in the background, the Sheriff of Nottingham's crew was creeping up on him, see, and the music was keeping time, bump, 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 and they'd come forward a little bit, you know. And my little brother, we were in a box because the Hydes always had a good position there. And he couldn't stand it anymore, and he got up and hollered, "Look out behind you, Robin!" Well, Robin kept right on singing, but he acknowledged the warning and then looked behind him just like my brother had told him, and in the nick of time, he skipped off the stage ahead of the thing. Well, afterwards, all the other kids that had been there, and this was a night performance, and we weren't usually there as young children, but they all, well, some of them at least, the younger ones his age, all congratulated my brother on saving Robin Hood. But the Dennis Shaw dances, I mean, they tell you nowadays that Sally Rand's had her name out. And it was an excellent performance. She handled those fans beautifully and the bubbles, I mean the balloons. But the Dennis Shaw dancers, and of course we always had the minstrels, and those are outlawed now. The Colburn minstrels, which were on national tour, but also the Elks and the Legion minstrels. Various, this is before Stover Theatre. A lot of the Stetson plays, Shakespearean plays, and all were held in the Athens. It was quite a place, and it was beautiful and clean and everything else. In fact, chewing gum wasn't quite as prevalent in those days, and there wasn't any popcorn in the theater. It was a more dignified listening place with chandeliers that reflected, and the loaves in the boxes, and the orchestra pit, and the organ. And,
well, this has been so very interesting. I could just sit here all day, but I know we must stop. I imagine your voice is tired.
I really haven't told you anything.
Oh,
and
you just can't believe how interesting.
Rambled because, I mean, this is the way I think of DeLand. There are a lot of things that are important, so on, but really it's just a delightful place to be from 1919 to now, anyway.
Well, thanks so much. I'm Betty Van Allen, and I really appreciate your time. It's just wonderful memories that you have told us about.
Thank you. I hope I haven't ruined it. I suppose I should have dug up some historical facts or something, but
couldn't have been more interesting, I'll tell you.